The brass nameplate on his door read Marcus Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer, in letters so polished I could see my reflection in them. I was on my knees scrubbing coffee stains from the marble floor when he walked in at 11:47 p.m. that Tuesday night. "You're still here?" I looked up, my hands raw from the industrial cleaner. "Yes, Mr. Whitfield, the quarterly board meeting is tomorrow morning. I wanted to make sure everything was—" "I don't pay you to think." He stepped over my bucket without breaking stride. "I pay you to clean." "My name is Naomi Chen, 23 years old, night shift custodial staff at Whitfield Capital Management in downtown Chicago. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through my thin jacket every morning when I left at 6 a.m. I made $14.50 an hour. Marcus Whitfield made that in approximately 8 seconds. I nodded and went back to scrubbing. What he didn't know was that I'd been watching, listening, learning. For 18 months, I'd been invisible in that building, a ghost with a mop who moved through the executive floors after midnight while they thought no one was paying attention. The stain came up slowly. I could hear him on the phone, his voice carrying that edge of irritation it always had past 10 o'clock. "I don't care what Henderson says. The Meridian acquisition closes Friday, or I'll personally see to it that his firm never brokers another deal in this city." I'd heard that name before, Meridian. 3 nights ago, I'd been emptying the trash in the conference room when I saw the documents spread across the table, numbers that didn't match, projections that seemed optimistic. I'd stood there longer than I should have, my eyes scanning the pages while my heart hammered against my ribs. "Are you deaf? I said you can leave." I flinched. Marcus was standing in his doorway, loosening his tie. A Brioni, probably $400. His watch caught the light. Patek Philippe, easily $80,000. I knew because I'd overheard him bragging about it to a client. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir." I gathered my supplies, my knees aching as I stood. "And Naomi," he said my name like it tasted bitter, "that bucket you're using, it's dripping on the hardwood in the hallway. Clean it up before you go." It wasn't dripping. I'd checked it twice, but I bit my tongue and nodded. I was halfway to the supply closet when his voice stopped me cold. "Actually, don't bother coming back." The bucket handle slipped in my wet hand. "Sir?" "You're fired." He didn't even look up from his phone. "Human Resources will mail you your final check. Something about budget cuts. You understand." Budget cuts. In a company that had just posted $340 million in quarterly profits. "Mr. Whitfield, please, I have tuition." "Not my problem." He closed his office door. I stood in that hallway for what felt like an hour but was probably 30 seconds. The fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Chicago skyline glittering like scattered diamonds. Somewhere down there, in a basement apartment in Pilsen, my acceptance letter to Northwestern's business program was taped to my refrigerator. Full ride, starting in 8 weeks. I'd been saving every penny for books, for a laptop, for a chance to prove that the girl who cleaned toilets could sit in those boardrooms one day. He looked at me like I was trash, like I was nothing. He had no idea who I really was, and more importantly, he had no idea what I'd seen. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my uniform before anyone could walk by and see me cry. Then I did something I'd never done before in 18 months of perfect attendance. I left my cart in the hallway and I walked out. Behind me, through Marcus Whitfield's office window, I could see him on his phone again, laughing at something, already forgetting I existed. But here's what he didn't know. 3 nights ago, when I'd seen those Meridian documents, I'd done more than just look. My phone had been in my pocket, and in the 60 seconds before I heard footsteps approaching, I'd taken pictures. Not because I planned to do anything with them, not because I was looking for revenge, but because something in those numbers felt wrong. And I learned a long time ago that when powerful people make mistakes, it's the invisible ones who pay the price. I just didn't know yet that I was about to become the opposite of invisible. The Chicago Transit Authority Purple Line was empty at midnight. I pressed my forehead against the cold window and watched the city blur past. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my roommate Jasmine. "Late again? There's leftover rice in the fridge." I didn't text back. I couldn't tell her I didn't have a job anymore. Not yet. We were already 2 weeks behind on rent. Our landlord, Mr. Kowalski, had been patient, but patience had limits when you lived in a building where the heat barely worked and the hot water was a luxury. When I finally got home at 1:43 a.m., I sat at our kitchen table, a card table we'd found on the street, and opened my phone. The photos I'd taken were still there. Pages and pages of financial projections, acquisition terms, and one document that had made my stomach turn when I'd first seen it. A confidential memo from Marcus Whitfield to the board of directors dated 2 weeks ago. Meridian acquisition projections adjusted to reflect board expectations. Original analyst reports suggest significant infrastructure deterioration not reflected in current valuations. Recommend proceeding with public optimism while privately securing insurance against potential losses. In other words, he knew. He knew the company he was buying was struggling, maybe even failing, but he was telling investors it was a gold mine. I wasn't a finance expert. Not yet. But I'd been taking online courses through Coursera for 2 years, watching YouTube videos on securities law, reading every business book I could get my hands on from the Harold Washington Library. I knew enough to recognize that what I was looking at wasn't just unethical, it might be illegal. But what was I supposed to do? Walk into the Securities and Exchange Commission and say, "Hi, I'm a custodian who got fired, but I think I witnessed securities fraud." They'd laugh me out of the building. I had no credibility, no degree, no proof except photos I'd taken while technically trespassing. I deleted the pictures. Then I stopped. My finger hovered over the trash icon. What if I was wrong? What if I deleted them and 6 months from now people lost their jobs, their pensions, their futures because of a deal that someone like Marcus Whitfield had pushed through knowing it was rotten? I moved the photos to a folder instead, encrypted it, buried it in cloud storage. Then I went to bed and didn't sleep. The next morning, I registered for my Northwestern classes: financial accounting, corporate governance, securities regulation. I added 2 more online courses: forensic accounting and business ethics. Jasmine found me at the kitchen table at 2 p.m., surrounded by printed syllabi and library books. "Girl, don't you have work tonight?" I shook my head. I got let go. Her face fell. "Naomi." "It's fine." I forced a smile. "I'll find something else. I always do." But finding something else wasn't easy. The job market in Chicago was tight in November 2018. I applied to 17 positions in 3 days. Retail, food service, office administration, nothing. My savings account had $847 in it. Tuition was covered, but books weren't, food wasn't, rent wasn't. On day 4, I swallowed my pride and applied to a staffing agency that placed workers in corporate offices. The woman who interviewed me, her name was Patricia, looked at my resume and frowned. "You worked at Whitfield Capital for 18 months?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why'd you leave?" I could have told her the truth. Instead, I said, "I wanted to focus on school full-time." She pursed her lips. "We have an opening, executive assistant to a managing director at Rothman & Associates. It's downtown, near Union Station. $18 an hour, but it's temp to hire. Interested?" $18 an hour was a fortune compared to what I'd been making. "When can I start?" "Tomorrow, 7 a.m. sharp. And Naomi," Patricia leaned forward, "these people expect discretion. You see things, you hear things, you forget things. Understand?" I understood perfectly. What she didn't know was that forgetting wasn't my strong suit. I remembered everything. If you're wondering what happens when an invisible person starts paying attention to everything, hit that like button, because Marcus Whitfield was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Rothman & Associates occupied the 34th floor of the Willis Tower. My new boss was a man named Gerald Chen, no relation, who spoke in rapid-fire bursts and drank 5 espressos before noon. "Naomi, I need the Henderson files by 10. Naomi, schedule a call with Singapore for Thursday. Naomi, where the hell is my dry cleaning?" I did it all, and in between, I watched. Gerald was a managing director in their mergers and acquisition division, which meant that 3 times a week I sat in conference rooms taking notes while men in $3,000 suits talked about companies like they were chess pieces. And that's when I heard it again. Meridian. It was February 2019, 4 months after I'd been fired. I was refilling water glasses during a strategy meeting when one of the partners, a silver-haired man named David Rothman, mentioned the name. Meridian Capital closed on Meridian Manufacturing last month, $890 million deal. Stock jumped 12% on the announcement. Gerald whistled. Marcus Whitfield's got the golden touch. Maybe, or maybe he's got a gambling problem. David tapped his pen against the table.
Our infrastructure analysts took a look at Meridian's facilities last year. It's a disaster. Factories are running on equipment from the 1980s, OSHA violations out the wazoo. We passed. Whitfield didn't. No, which makes me wonder what he knows that we don't. I kept my face neutral as I poured water into David's glass, but inside, my heart was racing. They'd passed on Meridian. Rothman and Associates, one of the most respected firms in Chicago, had looked at the same deal and walked away. But Marcus Whitfield had charged forward, telling investors it was the opportunity of the decade. That night, I went home and uncrypted those photos. I studied them until my eyes burned. Then I started researching Meridian manufacturing, not just the official press releases and investor documents, but the things people didn't advertise. OSHA complaints? 37 in the past 3 years. Former employee reviews on Glassdoor. Machinery breaks constantly. Management doesn't care about safety. This place is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Local news from Meridian's headquarters in Cleveland. 2 minor accidents in the past year. 1 injury serious enough to warrant a workers' compensation lawsuit. I made a folder, printed everything, cross-referenced it with the photos I'd taken. The picture that emerged was damning. Marcus Whitfield had bought a company he knew was failing, inflated its value to investors, and was now sitting on a time bomb. But I still couldn't prove intent. I couldn't prove he'd knowingly committed fraud. Not yet.
Spring semester at Northwestern was brutal. I was taking 18 credit hours, working 40+ hours a week at Rothman, and sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. My professors didn't know I was the girl refilling their coffee at university donor events. My coworkers didn't know I was the student asking questions 3 rows back in securities law lectures. I lived in 2 worlds, and slowly I was building a bridge between them. In Professor Whitman's securities regulation class, I raised my hand during a discussion about insider trading. What about situations where executives misrepresent a company's health during an acquisition? I asked. Is that actionable? Professor Whitman adjusted his glasses. Potentially, yes, if you can prove they knowingly made false statements to manipulate stock prices. The burden of proof is high, though. You'd need documentation, witness testimony, evidence of intent. Evidence of intent. That phrase followed me home that night. It was May 2019 when the news broke. I was at my desk at Rothman and Associates when someone turned on the conference room television. CNBC was showing footage of a factory in Cleveland. Smoke was pouring from one of the buildings. Emergency vehicles lined the street. Explosion at Meridian manufacturing plant, the anchor announced. 3 workers injured, 1 critically. OSHA has launched an immediate investigation into safety violations. Gerald appeared in the doorway. Turn that up. We all watched as the camera cut to a spokesman from Meridian, then to a brief statement from Whitfield Capital's PR team. Marcus himself didn't appear on camera, but the statement was pure spin. Our thoughts are with the injured workers. We're cooperating fully with investigators. David Rothman was standing behind me. I heard him mutter under his breath, and so it begins. I pulled out my phone and searched for more coverage. By noon, the story had blown up. Journalists were digging into Meridian's safety record. Former employees were going on record about ignored complaints. OSHA was talking about potential criminal negligence. And at the center of it all was Whitfield Capital, the company that had bought Meridian 6 months ago and assured investors everything was fine. That night, I sat in my apartment and made a decision. I couldn't go to the SEC. Not yet. I didn't have enough. But I could keep building the case. I could keep watching, keep learning, keep documenting. Because men like Marcus Whitfield always make mistakes, and when they do, someone needs to be paying attention. I'd been invisible for so long, but I was learning that invisible didn't mean powerless. It just meant patient, and I could be very, very patient. The Meridian explosion dominated the news cycle for 3 weeks. Stock prices for Whitfield Capital dropped 8%. Investors started asking questions. The SEC opened an informal inquiry. And then, just as quickly as it had erupted, the story disappeared. Marcus Whitfield went on Bloomberg television in June 2019 and gave a masterclass in damage control. He wore a Navy suit, an American flag pin on his lapel, and an expression of practiced concern. The tragic accident at Meridian was a wake-up call, he told the anchor. We've since invested $45 million in facility upgrades and safety protocols. We're not just meeting OSHA standards, we're exceeding them.
The anchor nodded along. Your critics say you should have known about these issues before the acquisition. Marcus smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Hindsight is 20/20, but what matters is how we respond to challenges, and Whitfield Capital has always put people first. I watched the interview from my cubicle at Rothman. Gerald was watching too, shaking his head. Guy's a snake, but a smart one. He'll get away with it. How? I asked. Gerald glanced at me. Because he's got enough money to make problems disappear. Settlements, non-disclosure agreements, friendly journalists. That's how the game works, Naomi. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but I was starting to realize he wasn't. By September 2019, I was halfway through my second year at Northwestern. My grades were perfect, 4.0 GPA in every course. Professor Whitman had asked me to be his research assistant for a paper on corporate governance failures. You have an eye for detail, he'd said, and you ask better questions than most of my doctoral students. The paper was about exactly what I'd been studying on my own, how companies misrepresent acquisitions, how executives manipulate information to protect stock prices, how regulatory oversight fails to catch fraud until it's too late. I didn't tell Professor Whitman about the photos on my phone, but I used the research to understand them better. Every night, I'd come home from my shift at Rothman and spend 3 hours analyzing documents. I'd built a timeline of the Meridian acquisition. I'd tracked every public statement Marcus Whitfield had made. I'd cross-referenced them with OSHA reports, employee complaints, and the internal memos I'd photographed. The pattern was undeniable. He'd known Meridian was rotting from the inside, and he'd bought it anyway, betting he could flip it before anyone noticed. The explosion just accelerated the timeline. But here's what kept me awake at night. I still couldn't prove intent. I had circumstantial evidence, I had suspicious timing, but I didn't have a smoking gun. I needed more. In October, something unexpected happened. I was working late at Rothman, nothing unusual. Gerald always had last-minute fires to put out, when I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. 2 partners were in the conference room. The door was closed, but the ventilation system carried voices through the ductwork if you were standing in the right spot. I'd discovered this by accident months ago. I shouldn't have lingered, but I heard a name that made me freeze. Whitfield Capital is shopping for a buyer. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering. Marcus is trying to offload Meridian? That was David Rothman's voice. Not just Meridian, the whole division. Word is he's overextended. The Meridian cleanup is costing 3 times what he projected. He needs liquidity fast. Who's interested? Couple of private equity firms, but here's the thing, he's valuing the division at $1.2 billion. That's insane. Even before Meridian, it was worth maybe $800 million. Now, with all the liability, he'd be lucky to get $600 million. So he's lying again. Or desperate. Hearing papers rustling, then David spoke again, his voice lower. If we could prove he knowingly misrepresented Meridian's financial condition during the original acquisition, that desperation would make sense. He's trying to unload the evidence before the SEC looks closer. Can we prove it? Not without access to Whitfield Capital's internal communications, and nobody's getting that without a subpoena. I stood in that hallway for 5 minutes after they left, my mind racing. Internal communications. That's what they needed. That's what everyone needed. And I had something almost as good. Photos of documents that showed Marcus knew exactly what he was buying. But if I came forward now, I'd be questioned about how I got them. I'd have to admit I took pictures while I was supposed to be cleaning. It would destroy any credibility I had. Worse, it might be inadmissible as evidence. I needed another way. That night, I did something reckless. I'd kept the photos encrypted for a year. I'd told no one about them, but I couldn't sit on them forever, not if Marcus Whitfield was about to sell off Meridian and walk away with hundreds of millions of dollars while workers dealt with the consequences. I created an anonymous email address. Then I drafted a message to the SEC's Enforcement Division. I have reason to believe Whitfield Capital knowingly misrepresented the financial health of Meridian Manufacturing during their 2018 acquisition. Internal documents suggest executives were aware of significant infrastructure problems before the deal closed. I'm willing to provide information anonymously if you can guarantee protection. My finger hovered over the send button. If I did this, there was no going back. The SEC would investigate, they'd start asking questions, and eventually those questions might lead back to me.
But if I didn't do this, what was the point of everything I'd learned? What was the point of watching, of listening, of documenting, if I was too scared to act when it mattered? I pressed send at 11:52 p.m. Then I closed my laptop and went to bed, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. The SEC responded 3 days later, a bland, bureaucratic email thanking me for my tip and asking if I'd be willing to provide documentation. I sent the photos, all of them, anonymously. Then I waited. November and December passed in a blur of classes, work, and anxiety. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected federal agents. Every time someone knocked on my apartment door, I thought they'd found me. But nothing happened. The SEC was silent. Whitfield Capital continued operating as usual. Marcus Whitfield gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal about his philanthropic efforts, smiling for the camera like he didn't have a care in the world. I started to think I'd been naive, that my photos didn't matter, that people like Marcus Whitfield were untouchable. And then, in January 2020, everything changed. The subpoena hit Whitfield Capital on January 14, 2020. I was in Professor Whitman's office when the news broke. He had CNBC playing on his computer, and suddenly the anchor cut to breaking news. The Securities and Exchange Commission has issued a subpoena to Whitfield Capital Management, seeking documents related to their 2018 acquisition of Meridian Manufacturing. Sources tell us this is part of a broader investigation into potential securities fraud. Professor Whitman looked up at me. "This is the case I've been telling you about. This could be huge." I kept my face neutral. What happens now? Now, lawyers, lots of lawyers. Whitfield will fight this tooth and nail, but if the SEC found something solid, he's in real trouble. Something solid like photographs of internal memos, like evidence of intent. I'd given them that. I didn't hear anything for 6 weeks. Whitfield Capital's stock continued to fall. News articles speculated about the scope of the investigation. Marcus hired a white-collar criminal defense attorney whose fees started at $1,500 an hour. Then, on February 28th, I got an email. It wasn't from the SEC, it was from a law firm, Henderson and Associates, attorneys specializing in whistleblower cases. Ms. Chen, we represent several clients with information related to the SEC's investigation of Marcus Whitfield. We believe you may have relevant knowledge. Please contact us at your earliest convenience to discuss potential whistleblower protections under federal law. My hands shook as I read it. They knew. Somehow they'd figured out I was the anonymous tipster. I called the number. A paralegal transferred me to an attorney named Rebecca Martinez. Ms. Chen, thank you for calling. I want to be direct with you. The SEC has identified you as a potential witness in their investigation of Marcus Whitfield. You're not in any trouble, but you do have options here. How did they find me? Digital forensics. The photos you submitted contained metadata that led investigators to your phone. I know you tried to stay anonymous, but in these cases, that's rarely possible. I felt sick. What happens now? Now you have a choice. You can cooperate with the SEC's investigation, which would likely qualify you for whistleblower protections and potentially financial compensation if they recover penalties from Whitfield Capital, or you can decline, though that might result in a subpoena anyway. And if I cooperate? Then you tell them everything, how you obtained the photos, what you saw, what you know. They'll verify your account, use your documentation as evidence, and you'll likely be asked to testify if this goes to trial. Testify? Against Marcus Whitfield? In federal court? Ms. Chen, are you still there? I'm here. I took a breath. I'll cooperate. On March 12, 2020, right as the world was shutting down for reasons none of us could have predicted, I walked into the SEC's Chicago field office and gave a formal statement. I told them everything: how I'd worked night shift at Whitfield Capital, how I'd seen documents left out in conference rooms, how I'd taken photos because something felt wrong, how I'd been fired days later. The investigator taking my statement was a woman named Sarah Yates. She had gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Ms. Chen, why didn't you come forward immediately? Because I was nobody. I was a custodian without a degree. Who would have believed me? But you kept the photos. Because I thought someday they might matter. Sarah studied me for a long moment. Then she slid a document across the table.
This is a memo from Marcus Whitfield to his board of directors, dated October 2018, 2 months before the Meridian acquisition closed. Do you recognize it? It was one of the photos I'd taken, but this version had been printed, highlighted, annotated by investigators. Yes. In this memo, Mr. Whitfield explicitly states that Meridian Manufacturing has significant infrastructure problems that would require an estimated $60 million in repairs he did not disclose to investors when he announced the acquisition. Is that your understanding? Yes. Sarah nodded. Ms. Chen, what you've provided us is evidence of securities fraud. Mr. Whitfield knowingly misled investors about a material fact that would have affected their decision to buy stock in his company. That's a federal crime. I sat back in my chair, the weight of it hitting me. What happens to him? If we can prove his case, he'll face civil penalties, possibly criminal charges. He could lose his company, his assets, his reputation. But that's a long way off. First, we need to build an airtight case, and you're going to help us do that. The investigation took 8 months. I gave 3 more statements, I sat for a deposition, I handed over my phone so they could verify the metadata on the photos, I connected them with former Meridian employees who confirmed the infrastructure problems, and slowly the case against Marcus Whitfield became undeniable. In November 2020, the SEC filed formal charges, securities fraud, making false statements to investors, manipulating stock prices. The penalties they were seeking exceeded $200 million. The news hit every major outlet. Marcus Whitfield, the golden boy of Chicago finance, was facing career destruction. I watched the press conference from my apartment. Sarah Yates stood at a podium, explaining the charges while reporters scribbled notes. This investigation began with a tip from a whistleblower who provided critical documentation of Marcus Whitfield's fraud.
That individual showed extraordinary courage in coming forward, knowing they were taking on one of the most powerful men in finance. She didn't say my name. Whistleblowers were protected, but I knew. And somewhere, Marcus Whitfield knew too. He called me in December. I was at Rothman and Associates when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Naomi Chen? I recognized his voice immediately. Mr. Whitfield? You destroyed my life. I walked to an empty conference room and closed the door. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. No, sir, you destroyed your own life. I just made sure people found out about it. You had no right. I had every right. You lied to investors. You put workers in danger. You broke the law. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. I'm going to lose everything. You should have thought about that before you fired me for no reason. That was business. This is also business, I interrupted. You taught me that. You said I was nothing. You looked at me like I was invisible. But you forgot something, Mr. Whitfield. Invisible people see everything. He didn't respond. I have to go, I said. My shift ends in 20 minutes. I hung up before he could say anything else. If you've made it this far, hit that subscribe button, because the ending of this story is something you won't want to miss. The trial started in March 2021. I wasn't called to testify until the 3rd week. I wore a navy suit I'd bought from a thrift store in Wicker Park, $40, barely worn, probably someone's interview outfit. My hair was pulled back. I wore the same small gold earrings my grandmother had given me when I graduated high school. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. Rows of wooden benches, fluorescent lights, and American flag in the corner. Marcus Whitfield sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than my entire year's rent, flanked by 3 attorneys. He looked thinner than I remembered, older. There were dark circles under his eyes. When I took the stand, I had to swear an oath with my hand on a Bible. Then the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Morrison, approached. Miss Chen, can you tell the court how you came to work at Whitfield Capital Management? I told them everything. Night shift custodian, $14.50 an hour. How I'd worked my way through community college before transferring to Northwestern. How I'd been invisible in that building, cleaning offices while executives made $1 million decisions 10 feet away. Catherine asked me about the photographs. I explained how I'd seen the documents left out in the conference room, how something had felt wrong, how I'd taken pictures because I thought someone should know. And what happened 3 days after you took those photographs? I was fired. Did Mr. Whitfield give you a reason? He said it was budget cuts. Catherine turned to the jury. Budget cuts, in a company that had just posted record profits. She looked back at me. Miss Chen, what did you do with those photographs? I kept them, for over a year. Then, when I heard that Mr. Whitfield was trying to sell Meridian without disclosing the full extent of its problems, I sent them to the SEC. Why? I looked at Marcus for the first time since entering the courtroom. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Because people were getting hurt. Workers, investors, people who trusted that executives like Mr. Whitfield were telling them the truth, and I had proof that he wasn't. Catherine nodded. No further questions. The defense attorney, a man named Richard Caldwell, who'd made a career defending white-collar criminals, stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket and approached me with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Miss Chen, you mentioned you were paid $14.50 an hour at Whitfield Capital Management, correct? Yes. And now, what's your current salary? Catherine objected. Relevance, Your Honor. I'm establishing potential bias, Richard said smoothly. The judge nodded. I'll allow it. Miss Chen, you can answer. I hesitated. I'm currently a senior analyst at Rothman & Associates. I make $72,000 a year. Richard raised his eyebrows theatrically. Quite an upgrade from $14.50 an hour. And isn't it true that whistleblowers in securities fraud cases can receive financial compensation? I saw where he was going. I'm not doing this for money. But you could receive compensation, correct? Potentially millions of dollars if the SEC recovers penalties from my client. The whistleblower program exists to encourage people to report fraud. Yes, I could receive compensation, but that's not why I came forward. Then why did you? I looked at the jury. 12 faces, watching me carefully. Because it was the right thing to do. Richard smirked. How convenient. Miss Chen, isn't it true that you were fired from Whitfield Capital for performance issues? No. No? You weren't terminated? I was terminated, but not for performance issues. I was fired because your client needed to cut costs, or that's what he told me. The real reason, I paused. I think he sensed I was paying too much attention. Richard pounced. Paying attention to private documents that weren't meant for your eyes. To documents left out in common areas where anyone could see them, while you were supposed to be working. While I was doing my job, part of which involved cleaning conference rooms after meetings, I didn't break into file cabinets, Mr. Caldwell. I didn't hack computers. I saw papers left on tables, and I took 30 seconds to photograph them because they concerned me. Concerned you? You're not a financial analyst. I wasn't then, but I was a student studying business and finance, and I knew enough to recognize when numbers didn't add up. Richard stepped closer. Miss Chen, how long did you plan this? How long did you look for an opportunity to damage my client's reputation? Catherine stood. Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained. Mr. Caldwell, rephrase. Richard smiled thinly. Miss Chen, when you took those photographs, did you intend to use them against Mr. Whitfield? No. I took them because I thought someone should know what I'd seen. I didn't know what I'd do with them, but when I heard about the explosion at Meridian, when I saw workers getting hurt, when I realized your client was trying to sell off the company without fixing anything, yes, I decided to act. So you admit you had a vendetta. I admit I had evidence. There's a difference. The judge intervened. Mr. Caldwell, do you have any further questions? Richard looked at me for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No, Your Honor. I think the jury can see exactly what kind of witness this is. As I stepped down from the stand, I passed Marcus Whitfield's table. He was staring at his hands, his jaw clenched. For just a second, his eyes met mine. I'd spent 18 months being invisible to him. Now he'd spend the rest of his life unable to forget me. The verdict came down on April 19, 2021. Guilty on all charges. Marcus Whitfield was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Whitfield Capital was fined $180 million. He was banned from serving as an officer or director of any public company for the rest of his life. The SEC's Whistleblower program awarded me $22 million, 15% of the penalties recovered. I didn't keep it all. I donated $5 million to create a scholarship fund for first-generation college students working their way through school. I paid off Jasmine's student loans. I bought my mom a house in a neighborhood where she didn't have to worry about heat in the winter. The rest, I put it in an investment account and went back to work. Because here's what Marcus Whitfield never understood. I didn't do this to get rich. I did it because somewhere along the way, I'd realized that being invisible gave me power he never saw coming. I finished my degree at Northwestern. I graduated summa cum laude. Professor Whitman wrote me a recommendation letter for graduate school that started with, "In 20 years of teaching, I have never met a student with a keener understanding of how power works and how to challenge it." I got into Harvard Business School, then Columbia Law. I turned them both down. Instead, I joined the SEC as an enforcement attorney, because there are 1,000 Marcus Whitfields out there, men and women who think their wealth makes them untouchable, who think the people cleaning their offices, serving their coffee, parking their cars are too invisible to matter. They're wrong. We see everything, we remember everything, and when the moment comes, we speak up. I ran into Marcus Whitfield one last time. It was September 2024. I was in Chicago for a conference. He was being released from federal prison after serving 3 years of his sentence. I saw him on the steps outside the courthouse, squinting in the afternoon sun. He looked smaller than I remembered. His suit, the same Brioni probably, but worn now, hung loose on his frame. He saw me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked over. "Naomi? Mr. Whitfield? I heard you work for the SEC now." "I do." He nodded slowly. "I spent a lot of time thinking about you, about that night I fired you. And I didn't see you. I didn't see a lot of people." He paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." I looked at him, really looked at him, and tried to find anger, but all I felt was tired. "I appreciate that," I said quietly, "but sorry doesn't give back the pensions people lost when your company tanked. It doesn't heal the workers who got hurt at Meridian. It doesn't undo the fraud." "I know," he swallowed hard. "I lost everything. My company, my reputation, 5 years with my daughter while she grew up without me. I'll never get that back." "No, you won't." He looked at the street where a taxi was waiting. "What do I do now?" I almost said, "Not my problem." The words were right there. But I thought about the girl I'd been. The one scrubbing floors at midnight, dreaming of sitting in boardrooms. The one who'd kept her dignity, even when someone tried to take it. You start over. You tell the truth, you own what you did, and maybe, eventually, you become someone who sees people. Marcus nodded. "Thank you." He walked toward the taxi. Halfway there, he turned back. "For what it's worth, you were the best thing that never happened to me." Then he was gone. I still live in Chicago. I have an apartment in Lincoln Park with a view of the lake. Some mornings, I walk along the water and think about that version of myself, the girl on the purple line at midnight, wondering if she'd ever matter. She did. She does. Because power isn't about how much money you have or how many people work for you. It's about what you do when no one thinks you're watching. It's about keeping your integrity when it would be easier to look away. And it's about remembering that everyone deserves to be seen. Marcus Whitfield taught me that. He just didn't mean to. If this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to hit that like button and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to know that being underestimated doesn't mean being powerless, because sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones who change everything. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, pay attention to the invisible people in your life. You never know who's watching, who's learning, who's documenting, who's going to make sure the truth comes out. My name is Naomi Chen, and I'm not invisible anymore.